We are back. We are working through Dr. Peter Lillback's book, A Wall of Misconception. We're on the fourth chapter today, dealing with the separation of church and state. So we're going to begin uh, to understand uh, the nature of this relationship as developed by our founding fathers. Um, at a later point, not today, but at a later point, we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson's metaphorical use of a wall of separation. And a little bit, we'll spend a bit of time giving some context for that and addressing it. And he'll uh, do some further things as well. So it's going to be a bit of a longer um, chapter here. But today we're going to look at the first couple sections of the chapter on the High Court's understanding of the First Amendment, and then how we got our Constitution. So that will probably occupy us today, and we won't likely get to the Bill of Rights with its First Amendment and how we got to that. But that's the plan for today. And what we're going to be looking at is kind of the cultural setting in which our Constitution was brought into existence, and then as well how that bears on the First Amendment. We're going to first kind of have a bird's eye view of the First Amendment given to us by the Supreme Court and various statements made by court justices. I thought it'd be helpful, before we get too far into this, to read some comments by different historians about the early American colonies and how they were set up for the Constitution as it comes into existence in 1787. We'll see in a moment that there was first the Articles of Confederation that were formed in 1781, and they were kind of, I guess you would say, they were hastily put together for the sake of conducting the war and its aftermath. But there were weaknesses and problems with that, and it really wasn't holding the Union together. I think there were financial problems too. I didn't happen to check into that. Just my memory is that it just was not a workable solution. So they came together and put together the Constitution as we know it. And we'll see that there were a number of comments by participants in the Constitution which recognized God's hand of providence in the arrangements of this and how it all got set up. So we'll look into that. But I did some reading as background material, and I came across this book of mine by Paul Johnson, A History of the American People. And he has a comment here about something of the background of the historical setting of the Constitution. And one of the things that he says here is on page 204, the Americans were overwhelmingly church-going, much more so than the English, whose rule they rejected. The Pilgrim Fathers had come to America precisely because England had become immoral and irreligious. They had built the city on the hill. Again, their descendants had opted for independence and liberty because they felt their subjugation was itself immoral and irreligious and opposed to the providential plan. There's no question that the Declaration of Independence was, to those who signed it, a religious as well as a secular act, and that the Revolutionary War had the approbation of divine providence. They had won it with God's blessing, and afterwards they drew up their framework of government with God's blessing, just as in the 17th century the colonists had drawn up their compacts and charters and orders and instruments with God peering over their shoulders. Then Paul Johnson goes on to raise a question, and his answer is going to be that after this very religious background leading up to the War of Independence, um, and he considers that the Great Awakening was a foundational motivation for the War of Independence. Without that Great Awakening, which was a revival under the preaching of George Whitefield, and then the work as well as the Wesley brothers and others at that period of time, Jonathan Edwards and so forth. There were great conversions and great turning to God in the American colonies, and the desire for a right relationship with God. And this is what prompted eventually their unease with being subjected to the yoke of the British rule and the sense of tyranny and oppression that brought on the American colonies, particularly with regard to religious life. Um, and so you got this religious background, but then Johnson raises the question, well, how is it that you have this very religious background forming particularly the Declaration of Independence, but then when you get to the U.S. Constitution, uh, all of a sudden you seem to have a very secular document with very little in the way of reference to God and Christ and scriptures and so forth. In fact, he says about the only notification was in, in Article 6, Section 3, which banned religious test as a qualification for office. And then at the end of the Constitution, you have in the year of our Lord 1787. He says, for Johnson, he says, you seem to have this moment in time where the Constitution is formed, where all of a sudden, after this strong religious background, you have kind of like a secular flowering in this moment, which produces the Constitution, and with only the barest of references to a religious context for it all. And he says, well, how can this be? Now, I would remind you that Lillback has addressed the Constitution and has indicated that there were a number of things in there that reflected the Christian world and life view. And so even though there were not these explicit outward expressions about divine providence and uh, uh, these kinds of things, you still had within the Constitution a Christian world and life view forming and shaping the terms of the Constitution, a recognition of the depravity of man and the need for checks and balances within the government, and other things like that. And so, and even in that statement, in the year of our Lord, you have there an explicit appeal to the sovereignty of Jesus Christ as the King over all, and his dominion over the nations of the earth. It's the year of our Lord, and not just BCE, before Common Era, or CE, the Common Era, or something like that. So, but Johnson says that at this moment in time, there was kind of a kind of rise of secularism just for a brief moment within American history. And then there's a return to the Second Great Awakening and strong religious influences thereafter. You can make what you will of that. He said that perhaps the American colonies were influenced by the developments in France, and, the French Revolution and the Age of Reason, the elevation of reason and so forth as a god. But you have here in the American colonies some influence from that, but not an adoption, not an approach that the French had, which was really an atheistic rebellion against God and Christ and his church, particularly within Roman Catholic configurations. But the American colonies did not go in that direction. They did not settle with that, but they were forming a government, and they were forming just the rudimentary nuts and bolts of how government is going to work. And so it seems to me that we need to see that in the light of the broader religious context, rather than something as an entirely as a departure from Christian points of view. For example, I, as a Christian, need to take my car from time to time into the mechanic to get it inspected, and different things need to be done during that period of time. Well, in many respects, that's a secular moment in my life. They're talking to me about the transmission or the engine, and something's misfiring, or I got to get the brakes fixed, or what have you. These are just ordinary things that occur, and there's a functionality. There's kind of a secular aspect to life. It's not that I'm living outside of God's plan at this moment, and I have no regard for providence or um, uh, God's blessing, anything like that, or that I'm somehow free of God's dominion over me. It's just that in the course of life, there are things that require some focus, and it's not directly, if you will, religious, not directly theological. It's necessary for the way that things get done, but it shouldn't be understood as something that's independent of God or reflecting a rejection of God and his dominion. It's just part of how we conduct our lives. So um, it seems to me that this is kind of what you have here with the Constitution. We're talking about the rudiments of how the government is formed. And again, the Christian value system is plain and evident within it in the way that it is formed, but they're not explicit affirmations. Now, I could have wished that indeed it would have uh, reflected a greater uh, religious cast, if you will, if it would have acknowledged God as creator and Christ as our redeemer and his word as our guide. That would have been far superior, in my view. That should have been right front and center at the start of the Constitution. But this is where we're at. And so um, uh, that was Paul Johnson. And I just would stress that the uh, appreciation that he had for the religious background leading up to the formation um, of the Constitution. Um, Eventually, we'll get to the First Amendment, and I'll have greater opportunity, I guess, to speak to that. Um, I think I'll hold off on some other comments that I've got. But here's a book that you might take a look at some point: The Separation of Church and State by Robert Cord. Um, he develops the thesis that um, the idea of separation of church and state was not an abandonment of Christianity or religion from all of government. That was not it by any means. Rather, it was opposed to the establishment of a government funded, supported church, which was, for example, the Anglican church rather than a Presbyterian or Congregationalist or Methodist, what have you. The Constitution was to be, if you will, kind of uh, colorblind to different religious sects, to use the language of that time, the different denominations. They were all equally um, welcomed and received within the United States, and there was not an established denomination that dominated the rest of the colonies. So that was his thesis, and we'll get into that, God willing, at a future time. I'm anticipating that a little bit. But getting back to Lillback, you remember that he's addressing an associate pastor who had concerns about the posting of the Ten Commandments on the wall in Chester County's courthouse. And he Lillback begins here on page 74 saying, "Your comment raises the question of what is the proper relationship of church and state in the American context. As we pursue this question, I will raise 6 issues. First, our High Court's historical understanding of the First Amendment. Second, how we got our Constitution. Third, how we got the Bill of Rights with its First Amendment. Fourth, the metaphorical Jeffersonian wall of separation between church and state. Fifth, the blending of church and state versus the cooperation of church and state. And sixth, the enabling of religious pluralism based on the values of the Ten Commandments." So uh, that's the outline of the chapter, and what we'll be considering God willing, in the weeks to come. But first, we take a look at our High Court's historical understanding of the First Amendment. So this is that bird's eye view I mentioned a moment ago, talking about the courts and their interpretation of that First Amendment. And it should have some heuristic value, if I can put it that way. This is an interpretive grid that those who are in authority within our nation's courts have uh, expressed their understanding of these things. So let's take a look at that. Scholars have discussed the melding of religious liberty with an appropriate recognition of God in the public square of government that I have been describing here. It has been termed America's commitment to a, quote, benevolent pluralism, end quote, and, quote, a common sense, end quote, approach to the First Amendment. Benevolent pluralism, common sense approach to the First Amendment. I believe this view has characterized American liberty from its inception up until the mid-20th century. This is especially well reflected by Mr. Justice Douglas. Speaking for a majority of his brethren, in 1952, he discussed what he termed the common sense of the American principle of separation. In essence, it is this: the First Amendment does not say that in every and all respects there shall be a separation of church and state. So, um, this is back in 1952. This is kind of in the height of the Cold War now era with the Soviet Union, the atheist communist Soviets. You got the Chinese as well, Red Chinese. So communism was very much on the horizon and the mind of Americans at this point in time. And there were influences within the nation leading people towards this atheistic, communistic view of things and how America might be improved if we adopted this sort of thing. And so there are voices within the nation that suggested that we need to have a stronger, stricter interpretation of the First Amendment, and this wall of separation between church and state needs to be not just a relative or circumstantial, but an absolute wall. And I think this is kind of the era of the McCarthy investigations and that kind of thing. So I think Lillback is describing his own understanding of the relationship between church and state as a common sense approach or a benevolent pluralistic approach. And we'll let him unpack that for us a little bit here. He begins by quoting Mark Howell, who lived between 1907 and 1967. He's a constitutional law professor and author. And Mark Howe, Howe, explains, speaking of Justice Douglas, went on to acknowledge that if absolutes rather than common sense were to shape our constitutional law, prayers in our legislative halls, the appeals to the Almighty and the messages of the chief executive, the proclamations making Thanksgiving Day a holiday, so help me God in our courtroom oaths, these and all other references to the Almighty that run through our laws, our public rituals, our ceremonies, would be flouting the First Amendment. In other words, they'd be opposed to the First Amendment and subject to the sanctions of the First Amendment if you had this absolutist view of what that amendment affirmed. A fastidious atheist or agnostic could even object to the supplication with which the court opens each session. God save the United States and this honorable court. That goes on, I think, still today, that declaration. The justice recognized, however, that's Justice Douglas, that any reading of the First Amendment which would compel the condemnation of the traditional religious ways of the American people and its governments should be avoided. He crowned his exemplifications of the tolerance resulting from the exercise of common sense with the homely piety, quote, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." That's quoted from Mark Howell's book, The Garden in the Wilderness, published in Chicago's University of Chicago Press, 1965. So you see here in Howell's interpretation of Douglas that there is a recognition that uh, the American history is suffused with various appeals to God and to divine providence, support for the Christian life, prayers being made to God, recognition of divine providence at work in history and time. And these kinds of things are throughout the government statements and actions and so forth, and certainly among the people as well. And to read the First Amendment in such a way as it destroys all of that is something which really is hostile to the intent of the First Amendment. Um, Clearly, the intent and the interpretation of that amendment over time. Clearly, if the founding fathers meant to put up this absolute wall of separation between church and state, uh, basically invoking an atheistic state over a Christian religious people, which is kind of quite a contradiction there. But if they insisted on that, well, it goes against the obvious intent of the founders and the interpretation of that over time for over a century or more, almost 2 centuries of the nation's existence. So Lillback comments, simply put, the interpretation of the First Amendment that underlies your concern is recent, and as a departure from our founders' legacy is a novel and essentially unhistorical. Is novel and essentially unhistorical. Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist, in his dissenting opinion in Wallace versus Jaffrey on June 1985, put it very succinctly. Quote, "The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned." Lillback notes that this pastor has adopted a worldview which is contemporary, secular, atheistic, really, in its approach, which is not consistent, I think, with Christian faith and values, but certainly is not consistent with the history of the American people. And so it's a rereading of that history, a denial of the obvious throughout the course of American history. And so it should be recognized that this is placing into effect an alien interpretation of the American government and founding documents. It's something that is not consistent with either the founding documents or their interpretation through the history of the country. Lillback continues, consider also the 1984 Supreme Court decision of Lynch versus Donnelly. Quote, "The Constitution does not require complete separation of church and state. It affirmatively mandates accommodation, not mere tolerance of all religions, and forbids hostility toward any. Anything less would require the callous indifference we have said was never intended by the Establishment Clause. Indeed, we observed such hostility would bring us into war with our national tradition as embodied in the First Amendment's guarantee of the free exercise of religion." So that's the Supreme Court statement in the decision on Lynch versus Donnelly. So clearly there is this sense that an absolutist approach to interpreting the wall of separation between church and state is hostile to the American system of government. It's alien. It's an impartation of something which is inimical to the values and beliefs of the American people. And so it should be rejected. And that is the opinion of the court as recently as 1984. So now we go on to consider how we got our Constitution. So Lillback is going to give us a little bit of a background to that Constitution. We're not getting into the details of the Constitution per se. We've already made comments on it already thus far, but we'll get a little bit into the background comments leading up to and interpreting the Constitution as it was being put into place. The Articles of Confederation, Lillback writes, were finally adopted in 1781. This first form of American government enabled the new nation to wage the war to secure its independence. However, the Articles showed obvious areas of weakness, which threatened the unity and strength of the new nation, eventually leading to the calling of the Constitutional Convention. It'd be interesting to take a closer look at those Articles of Confederation and see what they were about. I didn't have time to go into that, but examine them for any sort of religious perspective and what that might foretell with regard to the Constitution. But I didn't have time to look into that. Maybe we can do that at another time. Lillback writes, in May of 1787, 42 delegates arrived in Philadelphia to try to craft a constitution for the 13 states, no longer colonies, but states. Much debate ensued, with leading figures of the Revolution participating, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, as well as new, younger thinkers, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. I'll just pause for a moment and note that Paul Johnson looks on Washington and Franklin as deists, and does not, in particular, I guess most relevantly, Washington, and doesn't interpret him as an Orthodox Christian. We've pointed out already that there were a lot of things for Washington that indicated that he wasn't truly a deist, because deism does not really have a place for prayer and for providence. In other words, God's involvement in this world are outside the realm of a deistic deity. So I don't think that Washington really fit into the deist mold, although there were certainly kind of distant statements by Washington in different respects about God. In any case, Johnson does remind us that Washington was an Anglican. He was a member of an Anglican church during the course of his life. So I should say I also listened to an interesting commentary by a fellow who's a student of presidential history, among other things, James Altucher, who talked about a study by various historians ranking the great presidents of the United States, and accepting most recent presidents. He didn't talk about Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and so forth. But ranking earlier presidents, he viewed, along with others, he viewed Abraham Lincoln as the greatest American president, in part because of the conflict that he had to deal with there in the Civil War, and also the way that he rose to that, and the things that Lincoln did to free the slaves and so forth. He felt, and other historians look at Lincoln as the greatest president, but then Washington was right behind him. And Altucher talked about various failings in Washington's life, which his opinion was a lot of these guys were not very nice people, and then we would not like to be around them to a certain extent. Um, I think we tend to evaluate people based on contemporary value systems rather than what was current in the time. And at that time, for example, slavery was accepted, the accepted mode of managing the economy. That's the way that things operated at that time. Not to say that it's excusable, but that was the way things were done. So it would be kind of anachronistic to impose our understanding of slavery back into that time. Although, as we can get into further, Washington did, on his death, he freed all of his slaves, and he and Jefferson and others were not happy with the system of slavery, but it was kind of the way that the country was run at the time. That's how the economy functioned, and apart from that, the nation would probably collapse, have an economic meltdown. So there were certain things there that sometimes there are certain resident evils that need time to overcome. In any case, let's get back here to Lillback, noting that the Constitutional Convention had Washington, Franklin, Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Madison studied under, what's his name? He was the president of the Law College of Princeton. And so Madison was very much a devout Witherspoon, that's the name, John Witherspoon, Presbyterian, by the way. And Madison studied under Witherspoon and had a real value for Christian doctrine and prayer and these kinds of things. So there's strong evidence of his Christian faith. Anyway, indeed, the 81-year-old Franklin was the American patriarch at the time of the Constitutional Convention held at Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1787. As noted earlier, in a most remarkable way, he hallowed the convention with his eloquent call for prayer. I read that a while back. General Washington was then selected to preside over the Constitutional Convention. He set the tone of the gathering soon after his arrival in Philadelphia. Quote, "If to please the people we offer what we ourselves disapprove, how can we afterwards defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. The event is in the hands of God." Again, you see this recognition of God's hand at work in the life of the nation. We saw that in Washington's prayers in Valley Forge and the prayers on different occasions and the way God in his providence watched over the American Revolutionary Army and provided for them, fighting against the greatest power on earth at that time in Great Britain. So you see, Washington has this view of God's hand at work and also a sense of the need for integrity in the writing of this Constitution, such that their values, the people's values, are one and the same, and we all hold to this this system of government. This is what we truly believe, and we're not just putting something together that we don't believe in, but is popular or what have you. So they're trying to be very forthright in the construction of this Constitution. Lillback continues, looking back at the Constitutional Convention from the vantage point of the following summer, Washington saw God's intervention in the production of the American Constitution. On June 30th, 1788, after the ratification of the Constitution, Washington wrote to Benjamin Lincoln. I don't know who he was or if he had any relationship to Abraham years later. Probably not, but in any case, he writes, "No country upon earth ever had it more in its power to attain these blessings. Much to be regretted indeed would it be were we to neglect the means and depart from the road which Providence has pointed us to so plainly. I cannot believe it will ever come to pass. The great governor of the universe has led us too long and too far to forsake us in the midst of it. We may now and then get bewildered, but I hope and trust that there is good sense and virtue enough left to recover the right path." So, again, recognizing God's providence, God's blessing on the American colonies and the formation of their government, and then recognizing their own frailties and how they might get some things wrong here uh, as they go along the way, but trusting that God and his providence will continue to watch over them. In fact, Lillback writes, Washington wrote to his dear French friend and fellow warrior, Marquis de Lafayette, calling the Constitution a miracle. Similarly, General Washington noted, "Should everything proceed as we anticipate, it will be so much beyond anything we had a right to imagine or expect 18 months ago that it will demonstrate the finger of Providence in human affairs greater than any event in history." James Madison also considered the Constitution to be the result of a miracle. In a letter to Jefferson, he says, "It is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle." During the convention, Alexander Hamilton was summarized by Madison. "This was the critical moment for forming such a government. We should run every risk in trusting to future amendments. As yet, we retain the habits of union. We are weak and sensible of our weakness. Henceforward, the motives will become feebler and the difficulties greater. It is a miracle that we are now here exercising our tranquil and free deliberations on the subject. It would be madness to trust to future miracles. 1,000 causes must obstruct a reproduction of them." So these founders were cognizant of God's blessing on their activities and indeed the very special providence that brought this concord among the American colonies and states so that they all came together and agreed on this Constitution. And the Constitution itself, they thought, was a, 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 a remarkable document that they've arrived at. They saw the excellence in the Constitution. They valued what they've come up with after all of the deliberations and arguments back and forth. And having been in the Presbyterian and General Assemblies, you can see how you've got various points of view and clashes on the floor and differences argued forth. But then eventually the assembly comes together and agrees on different propositions or positions and so forth. And in some respects, I think you see the hand of God at work in how we've come to a unified decision. So this was true of the early American founders. And they thought that there was such a special thing that you just can't count on God bringing this kind of harmony and excellence at different points of time for the future. This was a remarkable event, and they're noticing that. And now that goes against the idea that this was a totally secular document and that it was something that was hostile to religion, hostile to any evidence of religion within public life. Why would they have these views of God's blessing so prominent on their deliberations and the effect of it all if the document itself was hostile to religion and the free expression of that religion within the life of the people? it doesn't seem to go together very well. Lillback continues, not every delegate was satisfied, but on March 4th, my birthday years ago, 1789, the day which had been chosen to be the starting point of a new federal government, 11 states had ratified the Constitution. North Carolina and Rhode Island ratified it in November 1789 and May 1790, respectively. The preamble of the Constitution highlights the quest for and value of the blessings of liberty. And Lillback highlights those words by putting quotes around blessings of liberty. Blessings are something that comes from God, right? It's not just I give you a blessing, what have you. It's clearly God's handiwork in the nation's life, bringing liberty, which is political freedom, a good government. And so the blessings of liberty are being highlighted here. And so the beginning, the preamble of the Constitution says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I wonder if that was the first time in public official language that our nation was referred to as the United States of America. Has a nice ring to it. I think we'll keep it. But you see here the presence right at the very start of a recognition of God's hand of blessing upon the country from the beginning for the sake of the peace, unity, and tranquility of the nation, its prosperity and defense and so forth. Okay, what time is it? 9:56. Well, the next section is on how we got the Bill of Rights with its First Amendment. So that's where we really get into the meat of the discussion really throughout the entire book here. How did we get the First Amendment? What does it mean? What are its implications? And we'll pick that up next time. So I hope that this has been of value to you, those of you who are watching on YouTube, and that you'll consider signing up, subscribing to our church's website so that you can get our sermons, homilies, Bible studies, not only on Saturdays, but also Wednesdays at 10 o'clock, and so that you'll be equipped and challenged to grow in faith and your understanding of God and His Word and how it applies to our world today. So please subscribe, and we'll send you notices of when our next meeting is occurring or when the meeting starts up. So God bless and take care. I hope to see you next time.